You didn't say anything. You didn't warn them. You just watched. And somehow, everything you predicted started happening. Patterns you noticed became outcomes they couldn't stop. Now curiosity has turned into fear. Because when someone sees the future too clearly, they stop calling it intuition. They call it a threat. So they dig. They search. They check your past. Not to understand you, but to confirm what they already feel. You're not guessing anymore. Silence is the most dangerous move you ever made, and you didn't even plan it. You simply stopped explaining yourself. You stopped correcting them. You stopped reacting when they provoked you. And that's when their minds began to collapse. People are comfortable with noise. Noise gives them something to grab, something to twist, something to label. But silence gives them nothing, and that terrifies them. Because when you don't speak, they're forced to listen to their own thoughts, and those thoughts don't like them very much. At first, they told themselves your quiet was weakness. They smiled about it. They assumed you had nothing left, that you were defeated, that you were shrinking. People always confuse calm with collapse. But then time passed, and nothing bad happened to you. No mistakes, no public breakdown, no desperate explanations. And that's when the discomfort started crawling in. Because weak people make noise. Insecure people overshare. Guilty people rush to defend themselves. You did none of that. Your silence became a mirror. Every pause reflected their insecurities back at them. Every unanswered moment made them imagine scenarios you never confirmed. They started replaying old conversations in their heads, wondering what you noticed, what you remembered, what you understood far earlier than they thought. You weren't present, but you were everywhere. In their thoughts, in their sleep, in that sudden tension they felt when your name came up casually. Silence removes control. When you talk, they can interrupt you. When you argue, they can twist your words. When you react, they can predict you. But when you go quiet, they lose their grip. They don't know where you stand, so they start assuming the worst. They begin filling the gaps with fear, because fear is their native language. Your restraint forces them to imagine intelligence, planning, observation, depth, and they hate that more than open confrontation. They started watching you more closely, studying your expressions, reading meaning into nothing. A glance became strategy. A pause became calculation. Your calm became suspicious. Because if you're not panicking like everyone else, maybe you already know something. Maybe you're ahead. Maybe you saw the ending before the story even began. And people don't fear what screams. They fear what waits. Silence also denies them validation. They wanted confirmation that they mattered to you, that their words could move you, that their actions had power. But you gave them nothing. No anger, no approval, no emotional currency. And when people don't get a reaction, they assume they're losing relevance. That thought alone destabilizes them. It makes them reckless. It makes them sloppy. It makes them paranoid. Soon, your quiet wasn't just absence. It was pressure. an invisible weight pressing on their chest. They began checking your patterns. When you were active, when you weren't, who you spoke to, who you didn't. Silence turns curiosity into obsession, because unanswered questions don't fade. They grow teeth. And the more they tried to decode you, the more complex you seemed. They told themselves you were hiding something, that no one stays that calm without reason, that no one watches without intention. Your silence suggested awareness, and awareness suggests advantage. So they started assuming you were ahead of the game, even if you never said you were playing. That's the irony. You didn't threaten them. You didn't challenge them. You didn't even acknowledge the game. And that's exactly why your silence made them nervous. They thought predictions were just words, harmless guesses, entertainment, something people say when they want attention. But yours landed differently. Yours didn't sound hopeful or dramatic. They sounded precise, calm, almost boring. And that's what disturbed them. Because when something comes true without emotion, without celebration, without surprise, it doesn't feel like luck. It feels like control slipping through their fingers. At first, they laughed it off. People always do when reality hasn't caught up yet. They dismissed you as intuitive, observant, maybe just accidentally right. They told themselves anyone could say things that eventually happen, that the world is predictable, that patterns repeat. But then the second prediction hit, then the third, each one lining up too cleanly, too accurately, too on time. No exaggeration, no drama, just quiet confirmation. And that's when their confidence began to fracture. Your predictions didn't disrupt events. They disrupted their illusion of control. Because control depends on surprise, on people reacting too late, on chaos staying unmanaged. But you removed the surprise. You spoke outcomes before they unfolded. You stripped the mystery away. And when people can no longer pretend they're steering the wheel, panic starts whispering in their ears. Not loud panic, careful panic, the kind that smiles while calculating exits. They started changing plans, adjusting behavior, second-guessing decisions they would have made easily before. Every move suddenly felt exposed, like someone was watching from above, already aware of the consequences. They didn't know if you were predicting them or influencing them. And that uncertainty was enough to shake their ground. Because when someone predicts your next step, you stop walking confidently. You hesitate. You slow down. You lose momentum. Your accuracy forced them into reaction mode, and people who live on control hate reacting. Reaction is weakness. Reaction means someone else set the tempo. You didn't chase them. You didn't confront them. You didn't interfere. You simply observed and spoke outcomes. That positioned you above the chaos without touching it. And that hierarchy was unacceptable to them. They needed you beneath them, guessing, hoping, failing loudly. Instead, you stayed still while their structures wobbled. They began questioning their own intelligence, wondering how you saw things they missed, how you connected dots they ignored, whether you had access to information they didn't. Or worse, whether you understood human behavior better than they ever could. That realization doesn't sit well with people who believe they're sharp, strategic, untouchable, because being out thought feels more humiliating than being outpowered. The more accurate you became, the more defensive they grew. They started guarding conversations, limiting access, filtering what they said around you. Not because you demanded secrecy, but because your presence reminded them that patterns speak louder than secrets. You didn't need inside information. You understood cause and effect. And once someone recognizes that every careless action feels like evidence waiting to be used, your predictions also expose their predictability. That was the real insult. Not that you were right, but that they were readable, that their strategies weren't as original as they believed, that their reactions followed scripts you already memorized. People hate mirrors when the reflection isn't flattering. And your words held up a mirror they couldn't smash without admitting what they saw was real. So they began trying to regain control, questioning your motives, undermining your credibility, reframing your accuracy as coincidence, anything to reclaim authority. But deep down, they knew the truth. You weren't disrupting outcomes. You were revealing them. And once outcomes are revealed, control becomes a performance, a fragile act held together by denial. And denial is loud, desperate, and exhausting. At first, it was interest. Casual, harmless interest. The kind that hides behind small talk and polite curiosity. They asked subtle questions, watched from a distance, told themselves they were just being observant. But curiosity doesn't stay innocent for long when it isn't satisfied, especially when the subject doesn't explain themselves, especially when answers don't come. Slowly, that curiosity rotted into something heavier, something colder, something they didn't want to admit. They noticed you weren't scrambling like others. You weren't rushing to prove yourself or clarify your position. You didn't overreact to uncertainty, and that unsettled them, because curiosity thrives on accessibility, on openness, on easy answers. You offered none. So their minds began filling the silence with assumptions. And assumptions, when left unchecked, evolve into fear. They started wondering what you knew that they didn't, why you weren't worried, why situations that rattled everyone else seemed to pass through you without leaving a mark. Curiosity whispered questions, but fear supplied the answers. Maybe you were prepared. Maybe you had leverage. Maybe you'd already accounted for every possible outcome. Fear loves imagination, and imagination doesn't need evidence to feel real. The shift was subtle. Their tone changed. Their smiles tightened. Conversations grew shorter. Laughter came a second too late. Curiosity still existed, but it was no longer playful. It was strategic, defensive. They weren't trying to learn about you anymore. They were trying to measure the distance between you and danger, between you and control. They began reinterpreting past interactions. Words you said months ago suddenly felt loaded. Jokes became signals. Neutral observations turned into warnings in hindsight. Fear rewrites memory to justify itself. It edits the past to protect the present. And in their edited version, you weren't just observant, you were aware. Too aware. A variable they failed to calculate early enough. Curiosity asks questions openly. Fear asks them in private, behind closed doors, in hushed tones. You weren't there, but your presence lingered. In their decision-making, in their hesitation. In that brief pause before they spoke, wondering how their words might sound if you were listening. Fear doesn't need an audience. It performs anyway. They started monitoring outcomes more closely, not to improve them, but to see if you were right again. Each confirmation tightened the knot in their chest, because fear grows strongest when it's validated. And validation doesn't always come from catastrophe. Sometimes it comes from accuracy, from someone seeing the ending before the beginning finishes unfolding. Curiosity once made them lean in. Fear made them pull back. They limited exposure, reduced contact, controlled environments. Not because you threatened them openly, but because fear prefers distance from anything it doesn't understand. And the more they tried to distance themselves, the more your presence expanded in their thoughts. Fear has a cruel sense of humor like that. They told themselves you were just one person, that they were overthinking. That power still sat firmly in their hands. But fear isn't logical. Fear is a feeling looking for justification. And your calm gave it plenty. Calm looks like confidence. Confidence looks like preparation. Preparation looks like danger when you don't know what someone's preparing for. So curiosity died quietly. No announcement. No dramatic shift. Just a slow replacement. Questions turned into surveillance. Interest turned into caution. Admiration twisted into suspicion. And fear settled in comfortably, because unlike curiosity, fear doesn't need answers to survive. It feeds on uncertainty. And you gave them more than enough. They didn't start by doubting you. Doubt would have been easier. Doubt is lazy. Doubt allows dismissal. What they did instead was far more telling. They began to investigate, quietly, carefully, as if touching something unstable. Because when people stop questioning whether you're right and start questioning who you are, it means the fear has already settled in. At first, it was harmless. A quick search, a casual scan, just curiosity, they told themselves. Everyone checks backgrounds these days. It's normal. But this wasn't about safety or interest. This was about reassurance. They needed to know where you came from so they could decide how dangerous you were allowed to be. Origins make people feel powerful. If they can label you, they can shrink you. They looked for cracks, old mistakes, inconsistencies, anything that could explain your accuracy without admitting your awareness. They hoped to find chaos, a messy history, a clear flaw, something that would reduce you to chance instead of capability. Because chance can be ignored. Capability demands respect. And respect is terrifying when it isn't earned through permission. Every detail they uncovered raised more questions than answers. You didn't fit neatly into the boxes they preferred. No obvious motive. No loud ambition. no trail of desperation. That absence disturbed them more than any red flag could have. Clean backgrounds are suspicious to people who live in manipulation. Calm histories unsettle those who survive on noise. They weren't searching to understand you. They were searching to disarm you, to find leverage before you ever needed it. Background checks aren't about truth. They're about control, about knowing which buttons exist in case they ever need to press them. And the fact that they felt the need to prepare at all told them something they refused to say out loud. They started comparing notes, cross-checking stories, asking others what they thought of you under the guise of casual conversation, watching reactions, measuring tone. Fear loves consensus. If others felt uneasy too, then the fear felt justified. And if others didn't, then the fear felt lonely, which made it louder inside their own head. They scrutinized your silence again, but now with a different lens. Not as mystery, but as concealment. Not as restraint, but as strategy. Everything neutral became intentional. Everything simple became calculated. When people are afraid, they don't see absence, they see omission. And omission feels like deception when paranoia is driving the narrative. They wondered how much you knew about them, whether you had already looked them up first, whether your calm was confidence or preparation, whether you were already 10 steps ahead while they were still gathering files and fragments. The irony never crossed their mind. They were the ones acting suspicious. They were the ones behaving like they had something to hide. Background checks are a confession disguised as due diligence. They admit vulnerability without speaking it. They admit that someone's presence alone is enough to trigger defense mechanisms. You didn't demand power. You didn't claim authority. You simply existed with clarity. And clarity is a threat to anyone who thrives on confusion. The more they dug, the more they revealed themselves. Their fear shaped the questions they asked. Their insecurity shaped the conclusions they jumped to. They weren't uncovering your past. They were projecting their future anxieties onto it, searching for justification to feel the way they already felt. They told themselves it was smart, strategic, responsible. But deep down, they knew the truth. You don't investigate people you consider harmless. You investigate risks, variables, unpredictable elements that don't respond to pressure the way they're supposed to. And once someone starts running background checks on you, it means you've already crossed the line from curiosity into concern, from concern into fear, from fear into quiet preparation,